why. You're never quite sure, but we're really pleased that you are all here, because we can pretty much guarantee an interesting discussion this afternoon on a very important topic on privatization or public investment in education. This is the fourth in a series of seminars that we've held this year with the theme of exploring the equity dimension of SDG 4, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, the education goal. And we're very pleased to welcome our speaker, Frank Adamson. I will introduce both the speaker and our discussant. But first, let me give a shout out, a warm welcome to our online audience. We are live streaming this seminar, this strategic debate, and I think we have even more people online than we have in the room. So we want to say thank you very much for listening and watching to all of us online. So I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis. I'm the director here of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the panel to you. And a particular pleasure because Frank, whom I only met today, but we're from the same graduate school and even the same graduate program at Stanford University. So it's an extra special pleasure. So let me introduce him without further ado. Frank Adamson currently studies the effects of different political and economic approaches to education on student experiences and their performances in schools. His recent volume, Global Education Reform, compares the approaches of privatization and public investment to education policy in 6 different countries. He's also studied the impact of system-wide charter school reform on students in New Orleans. And we have laid out for your taking away a couple of pieces of paper. You'll find a flyer regarding the book that he's reporting on today, as well as some information on his other research in case that is of interest. And there's also an infographic that you're most welcome to take away. Previously, Frank published on the adoption of assessments of deeper learning and 21st century skills at the state, national, and international levels, as well as on teacher salary differences within the metropolitan labor markets in New York and California. Frank has also completed studies for the U.S. Department of Education, the OECD, IEA, and UNESCO, including analyses of PISA and TIMSS. Frank began his career as an advanced placement high school English teacher and as an analyst for the American Institutes of Research. He earned a BA in comparative literature from Haverford College, an MA in sociology, and PhD in international comparative education from Stanford University. So we're very pleased that Frank is here and was able to put us on his tour as a visit. Thank you, Frank. We're most grateful. And it's also a pleasure for me to introduce our discussant for today, and that's Manos Antoninis, who is a senior policy analyst with the Global Education Monitoring Report, or the GEMR. He's been responsible for the monitoring section of the report since 2011. In recent years, Manos has coordinated, among other things, financing gap estimates for the 2030 education targets, the projections for the achievement of universal primary and secondary education completion, and the World Inequality Database on Education, known as WIDE. Manos has also represented the report in many different fora, including the Technical Advisory Group on Education Indicators for the Sustainable Development Goal 4. Before joining the Global Education Monitoring Report, Dr. Antoninis worked as a monitoring and evaluation expert in education sector projects, including public expenditure tracking, service delivery survey of secondary education provision in Bangladesh, evaluation of basic education project in Western provinces of China, and the midterm evaluation of the Education for All Fast Track Initiative, as well as the secondary primary education development project implementation in Bangladesh. We're pleased that he's able to join us. He holds a DPhil in economics for a study of technical secondary education and the labor market in Egypt, completed at the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. So you can see we've got quite a power panel today, this afternoon. So we will first hear from our main speaker, followed by discussant remarks from Manos, and then we will be sure to have plenty of time for audience participation and asking, so you'll be able to think about your questions or the comments. You're most welcome to speak in either English or French. We have simultaneous interpretation, so you should use the language you feel most comfortable with. Now, it's a pleasure to pass the microphone over to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And hello and bonjour tout le monde. Thank you to the IIEP for hosting this event, for Sue, for Manos for agreeing to be a discussant today. I appreciate the opportunity to present my work and our work, because this is not just my work, but this is a volume I edited and came up with a primary concept, but had many contributing authors too. So today we're going to jump right in because there's a lot of material I'd like to let you know about, and we don't have a ton of time because I actually want to hear from you. So we're going to start. As a way of introduction, you already heard I'm a senior policy and research analyst at the Stanford Center for Opportunity, Policy, and Education. We do research and we sit at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in education. So we really try to have those conversations that are difficult across different stakeholders. So in the 1970s, countries took some different paths towards education. In Chile, we had a coup which led to Milton Friedman's ideas of the privatization of education, specifically through vouchers, being implemented by Augusto Pinochet beginning in 1980. And then across the world, we had in Finland, we had a Finnish education society coming out of sort of a Russian influence, and they've adopted a focus on equity in education. And that led to some very different outcomes in the 2000s. So we fast forward 30 years, and in 2011, after waves of protests, we have hundreds of thousands of Chileans in the streets marching about education. Now, for those educators in the world, knowing how difficult it is to get people interested in education, for them to have them on the streets about it is something, it says something. And then on the other side, we have Finland, to the surprise of everyone in 2000, came out on top of the PISA scores, and then we all internationally descended on them to figure out what they were doing. So this study fits in that category, I guess. They finished in the, and consistently have finished in the near the top of the 40 in additional countries in PISA. So what am I going to talk to you about today? Basically, we're going to talk about a framework for understanding policies over time. We're going to look at the country case studies of 6 countries, and we're basically going to address a fundamental question of, do markets or market-based systems or governments provide the best education? So as I said before, I started this story with Finland and Chile, and the kind of paper in my head was, the paper title was The Future of US Education, Finland or Chile, because the United States, as you may have heard, we have a new president, and we're moving down the path potentially towards a voucher system. And the United States has oscillated on a public investment model or privatization model for decades now. And so I was thinking internationally, you know, what does this mean in the US context? But then let's broaden it and let's actually do some comparisons that actually can make sense. So we looked at countries that are geographically proximate, culturally somewhat similar, but have very different approaches to education. And for the statistics gurus in the audience, this is not a causal model. I'm not saying that any particular country with the decisions they made in the 80s have causally predicted their outcomes in 2012 on PISA, but I think it is important historical policy analysis that can provide insight into how different policies might turn out in the longer term. So we looked at Finland, which has been a public investment model in Scandinavia, and Sweden, which is privatized, really marketized since the 90s. In Canada and the United States, they're very countries that are decentralized in terms of governance. So we look at Ontario model in Canada, which actually oscillated a bit between the public investment model and privatization. I'll talk about that in a second. And the same for the United States in different locations. And then we look in Latin America, Cuba as a public investment model and Chile as privatization. So, just briefly to cut to the chase on the outcome side, what we have seen is that when you look at the year-by-year performance on PISA, and these are average scores, but you will see that the Finland has significantly scored above the OECD mean, while Sweden has dropped from a 510 in 2000 to 478 in 2012 on math literacy scores. So that's a pretty profound difference there at the end, and certainly a very different outcome than one would have predicted from Sweden that we knew in the 70s and 80s. Similarly, Canada has performed above the OECD mean, while the United States has performed consistently below the OECD mean. Chile has also had a performance that has not been sort of up to standards for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss. So that's the OECD picture. Cuba is not on this graph because they don't participate in PISA, but there is other information that I think is important when you look at the CERCE examples. In 2005 and 6, you see the Latin American average there. And this is the average of students at the highest proficiency level in 3rd and 6th grade. When we look at Chile, it's doing a little better. And then we look at Cuba, and they're in a whole different ballgame. So I think it's important to realize that, you know, we can quibble about whether assessments measure what they measure, whether they are the best measure of a national education system. But when you see differences like this, I think it's an important thing to investigate. So in the course of developing this book, we tried to figure out how to, you know, a big problem with comparativists is how do you figure out how to talk about what's happening in an individual country context across the different across countries and by level and topic. It's actually quite tricky. So what we did was we looked at 3 different ways in which education systems are organized. So there's the policy level, and then there's a rationale or discourse level, and then the mechanism or enactment level. And there are many other levels in that, but for simplification purposes, we'll talk about those today. So when we look at market-based approaches to education, we look at different things such as privatization, deregulation, decentralization, and market liberalization. And there are a variety of definitions with this, and we talk about it in the book, but I'm basically going to say that it opens the door for a variety of private actors to take a basically a prominent role in what is essentially a subsidiary state. So the state becomes only the guarantor of education when the private sector doesn't actually provide it, right? And so that's a very different notion than something like the welfare state or the social democratic state. So economic rationales, these are things like efficiency, the axis of choice, competition and quality, the idea that if you increase choice in a system for parents, that you are going to allow, you're going to force schools as organizations to compete against each other, and that will increase quality. Scarce resources is often a rationale that's used to say that we need to privatize because the private sector is more efficient. And equity, everybody claims equity, but the question is who delivers it. So when we look at the mechanisms for this, they vary across country, and I will stop here and say that these are this triangle is empirically based. We pulled it from the 6-country analysis. So we've seen vouchers in certain cases like Chile and the United States, charter schools in the United States, markets in Sweden, and standardization and test-based accountability are sort of subset features of how education is organized and towards what goals in this system. There are many others, and I will also point out a huge sort of issue in the book. We call the book Global Education Reform, but in fact, we are not including countries from Asia and Africa. So there's an opportunity for volume 2. And then we look at policy drivers for public investment. we think about things like public ownership and responsibility, equity, but equity as a driver, not just as a claimed outcome. And then the involvement of the public in democratic decisions, not just outsourcing decision-making to private entities. The rationales are economic and probably more socioeconomic rationales of universal access. There's about preparing citizens and equity again as a rationale. And then education mechanisms, if I were to take one takeaway from this entire presentation, is that the countries that pursued a public investment model invested in their teachers. They also had equitable funding of schools, infrastructure, and a whole child curriculum that's not distilled down to the test-based focus of math and reading, which happens when you have a high-stakes testing system in place. So onto the countries. We're going to look at Chile. The chapter is done by Abelardo Castro Hidalgo, who is a professor at the University of Concepcion. And basically in Chile in 1973, obviously we had a coup, and I just want to point out that in 1971, Allende declared that the year of education in Chile. So that really is a democratic education. So that is a very marked shift. So Chile was on one path with a welfare state, and it diverged through the coup, and to put in Milton Friedman's sort of large-scale neoliberal policies, in particular vouchers in education, and the change to the subsidiary state model. And in the case of Chile, this was possible due to state violence. So when we distill this triangle of what's going on in Chile, we look at the policy driver of privatization via Milton Friedman. The primary economic rationale is choice, and the mechanism is vouchers. And that there are a variety of other things at play, but we're highlighting what the main drivers are in the Chilean model. So what happened? Over time, we see that voucher schools, so schools that are receiving the vouchers from for parents, and for those who don't know what a voucher is, basically the state gives an individual the tax dollars for the individual to then take and spend at any school they're choosing, sort of publicly managed, or private, or religious. And that's an important distinction that we'll come up with later. But and then the private schools, purely private schools, not accepting the voucher, stayed about the same, decreased a little bit. So we see a fundamental shift in the provision of education over time in Chile. And who gets to attend these schools? And this is back to our question of what are the best practices? And when we talk about SDG 4, we're talking about equity. We're talking about equity of access, equity of outcomes. And so we look at what we see in this chart is a radical stratification. And so it's a little hard to see the colors. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit. Over here, oh, that's not the right button. We have basically in the public schools, well, in the private schools, everybody at the private schools is from the highest socioeconomic group. And then the purple and the green are the middle and mid-high groups of socioeconomic, and they're aggregated in the public subsidized or the private subsidized the voucher schools. And then the lowest two socioeconomic groups are the ones that are predominantly represented in the public schools. So we can see a very strong disaggregation by class and by type of school. And even the OECD has called it the most segregated education system. So what was the response? 3 waves of protests, 2001, 06, and 2011. Expenditure on public education, and there has been a transfer of power and new laws. So basically, schools are no longer allowed to profit. They're not allowed to select students, and this is a very important thing because this is what happens in the privatization model in other countries as well. It ends up being a system of creaming and cropping. So the idea is to get your best students in, you cream the best students, and you crop the worst students. And more often than not, best and worst are strange terms. Basically, it means the best test takers because that's what your school is measured on, how it performs in the text. And an abolishment to copay, although we don't know what the long run impact will be. So on to Cuba. Martin Carnoy was the author of this particular case study, and he finds 4 keys to Cuban education, which I'll get into in a second. But I just want to basically point out Cuba's public education model, public investment model, includes public responsibility. So there's very much a responsibility to the public. And yes, I know the government is not always responsive to the public in Cuba, but in this case it is. There's a value of universal access, and they focus on teacher preparation. So what we have are, I've discussed already, the consistently higher reading and math scores. And what I think is important in Martin's analysis is that these differences are not well explained by individual socioeconomic status or the teacher characteristics. But actually what he finds, and they do a very interesting regression analysis, which you need to read the book to fully appreciate, but they do a very interesting analysis where he finds the most important feature is state-driven social capital, which means that the state provides the environment for school success past the individual, what the individual brings to the classroom. I think that's a powerful model that we need to keep in mind here. And it results in less violence, less wage work outside the home for the students, and a more equal social class distribution. So why do the Cuban students do better? Basically, they have a highly organized society. You can call that a dictatorship, or so there's different ways to think about it. But they have a very controlled society. They don't have the level of deep poverty that New Orleans or other states have, or cities or countries. And the children's health is a high priority. School's an all-day affair, meaning that basically education is woven into the fabric of the social system. And children rarely change schools, and the teacher is very important to the child. And Cuba invests heavily in teachers centrally, and because the salaries are fairly equal, you're able to have a high talent pool within the Cuban system. So we're going to switch continents now. We're going to go to Sweden. Again, all of this information is just a very high level glossing over. I encourage you, not because it helps me with book sales, but to actually pick up the book, because the chapter authors really do present a policy analysis that anybody outside of the context would be very hard pressed to reproduce. So they really do tell a deep story about the approach to education within those countries. This chapter is by Björn Strand in Karlstad University. And in Sweden, we find a very different approach. We find this switch from what, when I talk about Sweden, everybody goes, oh, that's the social welfare state. And I'm like, that's not what's happening in education right now. Since the 1990s, it has changed. But here's a way to capture that change in the framing. So in 1948, the primary task of Swedish education was to form democratic humans. In 1970, education is a spearhead into the future and the key to abolish class society. In 2006, to run a school and to sell refrigerators are one and the same. And this is spoken by the founder of a huge for-profit school company. It's all about having your ear to the market and to understand what the needs are for our customers, the student. That is a profound switch in the orientation of your education system. And we've already talked about what it did to the outcomes, or what the outcomes of Sweden were over the same time. We see that the policy drivers here are decentralization, deregulation. And I'm going to say re-regulation, because there are always rules, right? It just depends on who the rules favor in terms of their ability or their ability to interact with the education, quote unquote, marketplace. The economic rationale is competition, and that's different than the choice rationale that was at play in the voucher system, right? So there's a little bit of a difference here, and the mechanism is markets. We see that private education originally had an influencing model in the Swedish system, where there was an idea of exploring alternative schools and developing new pedagogies. But then that switched to a replacement model in the 1990s, where independent schools are providing an alternative in terms of ownership and operation. So that, again, is this major switch that happened in the role of private education. And then when you look and you take a big picture view, right, we usually think about Sweden as this democratic welfare state. And we see that there is an atypical move in the 1990s towards decentralization and private ownership. When you think about Sweden in the extended perspective from the 1800s to the 2010s, you see that actually the stratification of Swedish education was the dominant modality, and that the actual attributes in the social welfare state were a potentially short-run move that was then counteracted. So it's important to think about what the role is of the welfare state and how it will play out over time. And again, there is a lot of information on Sweden in the book, but I'm just kind of giving a high-level feature of it since I want to get onto the questions. Then we look again at Finland. As I said, in the 70s, they focused on equity, and they ended up in PISA's top 3. And this chapter, I should say, is by Pasi Sahlberg, very famous Finnish educator. And the policy driver in Finland is equity. They're preparing their citizens, and they're doing it by having well-prepared teachers. And Pasi Sahlberg talks about what he calls the global education reform movement, the germ, and the Finnish model of education. So instead of competition in the ed reform movement, Finns do collaboration. Instead of the focus being on school choice and the input side, there's a focus on the equity of the outcomes. Instead of it being standardized, learning being standardized through test-based accountability and standardized curriculum, there's personalized to the child. Again, the focus is not on literacy and numeracy, but on the whole child. And it's not a test-based accountability system, it's a trust-based responsibility system. If you prepare your teachers well enough that you trust them in the classroom and you give them the necessary necessarily professional development to put them on a lifelong learning course and sustain their career, it's very different than holding them accountability through the narrow lens of test-based accountability. So again, once again, we see that the teacher investment is a fundamental cornerstone of the Finnish success. So now we turn back to North America, and we look at a critical choice in American education. This is a chapter that I co-authored with Linda Darling-Hammond at Stanford. And we look at the primary elements in the US situation, and I should say in particular situations in the United States, because in generally privatization is happening in particular in urban areas in the United States. And the way that it is happening, the economic rationale is choice, but this time the mechanism is charter schools. So charter schools are publicly funded but privately managed schools that essentially the rationale is that parents can then choose to send their students to those schools. However, we found that actually school choice is rarely a parental decision and usually a decision of the school about who gets into the school. So I'm gonna, in the interest of time, there's a whole analysis of where we've been in US education and where we're going, but I'll skip that. I will say that there are 2 examples in the United States. So the education reform for privatization happened through a voucher system first, but it was on a small scale. And the reason for that is the United States has built into its sort of political reality the idea of the separation of church and state. Well, vouchers in the Chilean model allow you to go to a religious school. So vouchers did not fly originally in the United States because of this uncomfortable relationship between the church and the state. So which is now on the table through a government that has strong relationships with the religious right and is proposing a voucher system which would open that door across the entire system. So that is part of the debate that's going on there. What we see in this graph is, again, we see this alignment or this coming together of the voucher enrollment and the Milwaukee public school enrollment. And I wonder if we're going to get to the Chilean point where I showed you earlier, another 15 years, where we get to this convergence that happens in terms of voucher schools and Milwaukee public schools. And at the same time, the claims of increased performance are not true. There's been no noticeable improvement in achievement in Milwaukee. And now I'm going to turn to New Orleans, and I'm going to reference that in the back you'll see, in addition to this infographic on the 6-country analysis, we'll see an infographic on what happened in New Orleans. I did a 2-year case study of New Orleans. So in New Orleans, there was in the United States, under President Bush, No Child Left Behind established a school turnaround policy. And that school turnaround policy was based on a punitive sanction model, which said that if your students are not making adequate yearly progress, we're going to reconstitute your school through a variety of mechanisms. The state of Louisiana started the Recovery School District under that law to gather up the worst performing schools into a new school district statewide. And why do I say this? Because in 2005, Hurricane Katrina happened. Most people think that the Recovery School District started with Hurricane Katrina, but it did not. It was implemented, it was already structurally in place. And then it was used to take over the New Orleans system after the disaster of Hurricane Katrina. So most of the New Orleans schools were placed into the Recovery School District. Run schools were turned into charter schools. 7,000 public school teachers were fired, and these are teachers without due process, with tenure. And I interviewed over 100 people in New Orleans, and one of the charter school principals told me, was the school system stolen? Yeah, it was. So, I mean, there's a whole level of kind of collusion that happened to privatize, forced privatization in this particular area. And this is important globally because New Orleans is being used as a rationale for outsourcing the entire Liberian country education system. So it matters as the policy borrowing happens around the world, where the charter schools in the United States and voucher systems are held up as high-performing systems, and that's not really what's happening. So what happens? From 2007 to the current, we see a widespread zero-tolerance discipline climate, and I'll talk about that in a second. The test-based accountability incentivizes pushing out students. So if you have students that are not performing well, you push them out. One of the most famous dates in New Orleans school year is, I think, October 3rd. It's the day after you get the money for the student to be in your classroom for the semester, because then you can then send them out of the classroom or out of your school, coach them out. There's a ton of loopholes. But basically, if you can get the money for them and get them out before test day, your test scores will go up. It's very problematic in terms of if we think about what the goals of equity and actually educating our students are. So then you're saying, well, why doesn't the school get closed down for this? Well, you know, if you're a charter school, you have a 3-year window where you're not in the accountability process, right? So if you close your charter school after 3 years and then you reopen under a new name with a new principal, or even the same principal, then you get out of your accountability window again. So there are some real loopholes that are built into that system for not only the students and the schools. So what happened? Basically, we look at student achievement by school tier, and I also have to say here that we did not receive all the data for New Orleans from the state of Louisiana. So the findings from other studies about New Orleans and Louisiana are not scientifically verified, because I would have done a mobility analysis from 2005 to 2015 if I were given the data. So there are a lot of other studies. There are a couple other studies going on that show that that student achievement has increased, but we found in the data we did have that the student achievement decreases by the tier of school. So New Orleans was a very unequal system beforehand. The American South has racial segregation problems that you're well familiar with, and those problems have persisted throughout the 1990s and 2000s. But the solution that was proposed has ended up creating a system of not just 1, 2, or 3 tiers of schools, but 8 tiers of schools, with the student achievement dropping in each tier. And we look at 3 main tiers of schools. And then you see that the percentage of white students in the tier 1 is almost 90%. 9 out of every 10 white students goes to the top tier schools, right? So the racial segregation, in addition to the achievement segregation, is massive. And then I have some quotations about what happens in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 schools. I won't get into that. I just want to say briefly that in tier 1 schools, when I walk into a tier 1 school, I walk up a 50-foot staircase of marble stairs into what we all know is a red brick stair house, and I go right and I go to the principal's office. At a tier 2 school, I walk into a set of modular buildings, and in the modular building, the first thing I do is I hit the security gate where I go through a metal detector. And then I'm walking on lines that are painted on the floors around the classrooms because kids have to walk on lines. And by the way, they're pennants for Ivy League institutions on top of the on the wall. So Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are on the walls. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton don't have lines in their floors, but correctional facilities in the United States do. So it is a very big question about what these students are being trained for, and that's what I meant by zero tolerance discipline policies. These students, their behavior is highly regulated to the point where if you're not making eye contact with a teacher, you can get a demerit. 3 demerits detention, 3 detention suspension, 3 suspensions to expulsion. By the way, I take your money for your seat. So it's a very problematic issue. Tier 3 schools. Tier 3 school, I walk up and there's a 12-foot fence topped with razor wire. That school is headed by a person who was a former warden at a correctional facility, who works for a correctional facility that runs a school that manages correctional facilities in 5 other states. So when we talk to a school about a school to prison pipeline in the United States, it's actually not a pipeline as much as it's the same system. So I just want to be clear about how stratified it is in these particular areas. Does that affect every person in the United States? No. But that's how the privatization marketplace has played out, especially for the most marginalized students. Okay, we don't all do that all the same way in the United States. We have other systems, other states that have done quite well in their performance, and we see Louisiana's almost at the bottom. And basically, they have a lot of these Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey's have reforms in investment, teaching, and policy. They're in the book. I won't spend time on it today, but they're much more like Finland than they are like New Orleans. So finally, we look at the story of Ontario. Basically, in 1995, Mike Harris was elected governor of Ontario, premier of Ontario. He took an economic approach that lowered taxes and cut spending on government programs, and cut $1 billion from the education sector, right? And almost got to the point of instituting a voucher. It was in the legislation, but never enacted. Fast forward, and this model was deregulation, competition, and vouchers. So what happened over those years was there was stagnant student performance, a labor disruption, and public dissatisfaction to the point where Dalton McGuinty was elected in 2003 on a public investment education platform. And he was able to implement the whole school reform model, and the principles of that model are progressive partnership with the teaching profession. So in the United States, when you think about teachers' unions sitting down with business and government, you think about a hugely contentious room, and probably the fact that that meeting doesn't happen very often. Actually, in Toronto and in Ontario, as I understand it, the unions have a key role. They sit with the government, they sit with parents and community members, and they all figure out what the best education system is. And that's what I mean when I say democracy versus the special interests that often dominate under a privatized model. And basically, again, back to the drivers, democratic decisions at the top, preparing citizens and hold children. So there's a lot more to say on Ontario, but I'm going to say basically I just outlined what happened, and I want to say at the end that the Ontario case reveals the possibility of reversing course on privatization, meaning that they were pursuing a privatization model, and basically the public didn't like it, and they voted it out. So there is a recourse in certain places for going back from this model. And then they achieved very positive results. It's not just about the model, it's about what the model does. And so what we see are some very different outcomes within the very same, not even comparing countries, within the very same city and territory in Canada. So my final slide, I just want to outline some major themes that we found as we compared privatization to public investment. We found declining achievement on international and local-based assessments versus growing achievement, greater segregation, greater inequality on the privatization side, and then more push out of our most marginalized students. and teacher shortages, because honestly, the teachers are less inclined to work in systems where they're hampered by high stakes accountability and they're not paid on par with other professions. That is in very stark contrast to greater integration, more equity, increasing attainment in the public investment model, and surpluses of teachers. The competition to be a teacher in Finland is actually quite high. So that means that it's very professionalized. And you look at Sweden in the Talus survey reported, I think the teachers had one of the dimmest views of their teaching profession in the entire Talus survey. So on that note, I know it's a lot of information. Thank you for sticking with me. Et merci.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I imagine some representatives of all the countries you've spoken of may be in the audience, so we're expecting some feedback on that.
Yeah.
But first, I invite Manos Antoninis to share with us his commentary as our discussant. Thank you, Manos.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and I have to say I'm not sure why you have invited me. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm not going to question any of that.
You should.
How could I? I agree with all the recommendations. I haven't had the chance to read the book, but I had the chance to read the summary of one of your chapters. And all the recommendations are the kind of recommendations we have at the Global Education Monitoring Reports from year to year. Equity, orientation, child well-being incorporated into the curriculum and the school life, building professional capacity, and also assessments, not only of, but also for learning. And in fact, it was good to see the use of some of these assessments. Sometimes when someone looks at a term like global education reform in a book, usually that comes together with a bit of demonizing of some of these assessments, but I think it's useful to take what we can from these assessments because they do tell us, and they are really the bread and butter of much of our comparative work, and it's important to neither deify nor to demonize. I have 2 points to make, but before I get to them, just a couple of examples that made me think twice, and sometimes it's the way we present. We don't want to create necessarily polar opposites, which actually may not be black and white and more gray. You did point that in Chile, even the richest score below the average in OECD countries, but let us not also forget that Chile is not doing so badly for its region and has been growing. Yeah. So it's important not to forget that. And you used the really, I mean, really, I had actually to go to the Talus report because I couldn't believe it. I was wondering whether there was a mistake in the translation, but it's true that in Sweden, 1 in 2 teachers would not choose a career if they were to choose again. It's unbelievable. In Chile, though, it's not the case. In Chile, it's more than the average of teachers seemed, according to the same survey, to be satisfied with that. So it's important to look at all different aspects because the country also does other things. I mean, even in a market-driven system like Australia, I think the teachers scored, like, claimed that they were happier for their profession than the average. So there's more to the story than just black or white. And what can we say about the fact that in Malaysia, the teachers were satisfied in 93%? We know actually Malaysia is one of those countries in Asia that do try some of these accountability-based approaches, even though not particularly successfully, but that they have already that orientation. But don't get me wrong, these are just observations for the discussion. The question that Frank raised is very serious. Let us not forget it took Chile 25 years to decide to make educational apartheid, as it was rightly called, illegal. And let us not forget that in Liberia, people may not go out in the street to protest. May not have the same capacity. So it's very important to take this question seriously. But the first point I want to make in my comments, in my response, is to say that, first of all, as you also recognize, it is not a global picture of privatization and its different forms. It's more like a World League kind of comparison. As in the United States, it's a World League in the US and Canada, so not the rest of the world. Of course, you want to step further. and you mentioned that you have a plan B now, a volume B, which I think would be very welcome. So I just wanted to therefore mention some other examples of privatization that we often forget, and they're actually really pervasive, and they're just so in front of our eyes, but we don't see them. In the report, in the Global Education Monitoring Report, we have been trying for a long time to draw attention to the very high percentages of household spending. And people don't talk about that because in high-income countries, 18%, we had an estimate of about 18% of total funding of education comes from households. But in middle-income countries, it's 34%. In low-income countries, it's 49%. I mean, that's the most egregious form of privatization that exists in the world, and nobody talks about it. And it's to the credit of IIEP and UAS and GP that funded this approach to national education accounts, where we see that if you actually add the amount of household spending on top of public spending, you actually see the whole ranking of national emphasis on education being completely turned upside down. Vietnam appears to be spending more money from government on education compared to Nepal. There's a difference of 2.5 percentage points. But if you add the household spending, Nepal spends 1.5 percentage point more of GDP for education. That's a really very strong example of what's going on. Shadow education. That's another form that, of course, many people talk about it, and this institute in particular championed it as an issue a few years ago. I am a product of that system. In my country, just before the crisis started, I'm Greek. In Greece, 20% of total spending on primary and secondary education was actually coming from private tuition, supplementary private tuition. And that I'll come later to that as to what takes us to this situation. Early childhood education, another example. 41% of total enrollment globally is in private institutions. We've been referring about privatization in primary and secondary education. That's in the range of 10 to 15%. Early childhood, 41%. What does this tell us about why such a phenomenon occurs? Similarly, vocational professional education. India promised to train 500 million people and provide them with skills. How could that ever be possibly implemented? It didn't actually get to the end, but it gave rise to a massive increase in private, so non-government providers. Similarly with tertiary education, where we have seen an expansion of private enrollment, although it's not very clear exactly because the statistics on tertiary education are more complicated. It gives an example of India. In India, between 1980 and 2015, the number of medical schools, government medical schools, almost doubled. The number of private medical schools increased 20 times. So there are forms of privatization that are very, very diverse, and it's important to cover them all in a book that wants to address such an issue. So as I said, one thing I don't agree very much is a little bit the black and white characterization of some of these examples, although there is no doubt there are some very bad guys in some of these stories, and we saw them also in pictures. I also didn't agree with a question that you had in one of the first slides: do governments or market-based systems provide the best education? I'm not sure that is the right question. I think the right question to ask is how, under what conditions and circumstances, is a state retreating from its responsibilities? And how can this prevent it, given that, as you indicated, it is a slippery slope? So using history, I think the chapters and a little bit the chance I had to look at some of the examples in more depth, it is really the more nuanced stories that make the analysis very interesting. And I don't know the United States very well, so I'm in between two Americans, so I shouldn't be. But one of the most fascinating examples I've read about the United States is from Helen Ladd, the experience of North Carolina and how a system that was actually working very well in a southern state was dismantled in the space of a few years and essentially torn apart. So asking the question under what circumstances this happens is very interesting. So let us take some of the cases above, because it's important to recognize also the responsibility of the government that takes us to such a situation where suddenly its authority or role is undermined and challenged. Low-fee private schools that were mentioned there. It's true that currently we observe in some cases, one might say even unashamed attempts to promote some of these chains of schools. But let's not forget that the window of opportunity in some of these countries arose perhaps out of government responsibility, because the quality of public schools had deteriorated. And in a space of a generation, the percentage of children who would finish primary school being unable to read increased dramatically. Of course, this has to do with the fact that the first generation of schoolgoers were already from the families that were better off, whereas the second and third and the last wave of children come from much poorer families. But it's true that this deterioration happened. So it's normal to expect some response from families. So the question is, how do governments respond to address their concerns? And let's not also forget that the government was taking a very, very tough stance on issues of setting up schools in slum areas or in illegal areas. And that's then led to the creation of local solutions that were driven by non-government providers. Could this have been prevented by a more tolerant attitude to internal migration, etc.? What explains the fact that there are countries like I call it the NGO Republic of Bangladesh, where there are so many non-government providers? One might not call it outright privatization, but actually it's non-government provision. Why? What were the conditions that made that happen? I'll take you to another example, which is from my personal experience. You might not want to actually call it privatization, but we refer to faith-based schools. In Nigeria, in 1974, all faith-based schools were nationalized. They became part of the government. And in the north, where these schools were actually Islamic, at the time, people carried on going to both a secular government school, nationalized school, and a religious school. But at the time, a family who was sending a child to Islamic school was also keen to send the child to a secular school, because they believed that they were complementary to each other. A generation later, with the neglect of public education, you actually find that once you control for every other characteristic, a family that is keen to send its child to a religious school is not keen to send its child to a public school. And qualitative evidence suggests that families were just basically fed up. They did not believe in the complementarity of the two systems. So something went wrong there as well. Early childhood, I'm coming to the end. Why has the private sector moved in? Was the government not flexible enough to recognize the importance and also to provide nurseries and kindergartens in a way that would be catering to the needs of families? Tertiary education, free in many systems. That's a public investment model in some way. But again, come to my country. Without any other support, is the most inequitable system. It needs other ways to ensure that everybody benefits and not just the richest. So I'm closing with this example. I think you can mention your own experiences and your own thoughts about your own direct impressions from privatization. One last question I had, and maybe that could motivate a little bit the discussion, is that you presented decentralization as a privatization-oriented policy, and I hear that from time to time, but I also recognize that decentralization has been a progressive policy. So I wonder how the two actually can be put together without confusing. Whether it's wise to, again, present decentralization in such colors that perhaps we miss part of the picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manos. So between these two, the presentation and Manos's comments, I think we have an even richer understanding of the policy landscape in education, the choices that are made. I think it's having this historic perspective, which Frank hasn't really had the time to do justice to it, but the book goes into it in far greater detail. The historical perspective is important, a much more complex set of measures of what is privatization. It's not simply the role of the government's purposeful role, or it's also about household roles, faith, school, you would call it church-based or faith-based schooling. What is the role of NGOs? It's kind of echoing a debate that is across education, not just in policy debates about what do we mean by private, because it's in some ways it's a meaningless term, but I know in the book it's very clear that it's defined in these terms. But I think what we have now is a much richer set of comments. I want to give Frank an opportunity to respond to Manos, and then we will open it up to the floor. Frank?
Okay, great. I'll be very brief because I've been talking a lot. On the decentralization question, when we talk about Finland, Finland is decentralized. They trust their teachers, so we talk about decentralization with quality. Whereas if you have decentralization and that's an excuse to shift resources from marginalized students upwards, then that's not really providing quality. So that is a much more nuanced picture that I would absolutely agree with. One of the other themes you talked about was just the overall, for lack of a better word, failure of the state to provide high quality education to all students. And that gap producing demand, obvious demand from parents for any kind of option. That's the rationale of the entire charter system in the United States, was that basically African-American populations have been disenfranchised throughout the history of the country, and they're looking for any option in if they can get their own money through charter schools and run their own schools independent of government oversight with whatever money they get, then they're going to take that option. But the problem is, when this gets to another question about what we mean by privatization, it's not a perfect term, but we have to figure out, I mean, there's commercialization, market-based, but there is this idea that the private sector, albeit non-profit, for-profit, is taking a larger chunk of the government's role. And that is problematic because the private sector may not be accountable to all of the people, and in fact may have differential incentives that make the private sector need to account to their shareholders, pursue inequitable policies within the education sector. So that's the problem I'm getting at. Is it fully articulated in a nice, neat little word or box? No, not really. And I don't want to present it as black and white, because there are, as you mentioned, obviously many different ways to provide education. But I think that we are seeing a move to address the government's, for whatever reason, not providing the high quality equitable education that we know can be provided. It's not like we don't have cases that are in the positive. So I think that's also an important thing. It's empirically possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the audience now. I would encourage you to both react to the comments here, but also share with us, thank you. Share with us whether this analysis makes sense in the context with which you're most familiar, be it your own country or countries you've lived in and have experience in the education systems. I know that you mentioned a volume B. There is a desire on the part of the scholars at the Stanford Center to take on additional country cases, to investigate those, to see whether or not this analysis holds in other contexts, and if not, what is it that's different? What kinds of outcomes make sense to be tracking and in looking at the policy drivers, etc. So the floor is open. We will have several rounds, so don't despair if you're not in the first round. Just raise your hand and we'll come around with the microphone. Would you please, for the benefit of everyone here, but also the benefit of our audience online who's listening to the live stream, please introduce yourself because our camera is not following you when you speak. All right, thank you. Anton?
My name is Adamson. I work at this institute. Thought is very rich, and I'm to a large extent comforted by the conclusions, because to a large extent I agree with the conclusions. But I do have two concerns. My first concern is that I'm wondering if the success of the countries you highlighted is related to the policy package of public investment, where it's not as much related to the characteristics of the governments, characteristics of the state to some extent, and the characteristics of the society. I'll explain a little bit. The three governments you highlighted are governments and traditionally have been very generous, have been effective, and have really the public interest at heart. Whatever one may say about Cuba, has always invested a lot in health and education. Wondering if we would implement the same policy package, and we've seen that actually, and that's what Manos was referring to. We implement the same policy package in governments which do not have the public interest at heart and are not at all effective. But we end up with, in many cases, unfortunately, are indeed poor quality, extremely poor quality public schools. And so maybe if I'm wondering if your analysis would have looked at Mexico rather than Cuba, would have looked, with all my sympathy for the French people in the public, but would have looked at France rather than Finland. If your conclusions would have been exactly the same, or if one could have turned around the argument. I think that's an important issue. Second issue, I also think it's also important to keep in mind the social characteristics and the existing inequities in society. Again, we have three countries which are relatively equal, not only in the education system, but in the whole society. And again, we could give different examples there. And that brings me to my second important point. I think there are in the policy package of public investment. Obviously, I fully agree with you. Allowing parental choice for education very quickly turns into no longer parents choosing schools, schools choosing parents, and that's very dangerous. At the same time, at the moment, in many public investment systems, we have a form of school mapping, as we call it, whereby you are assigned to a particular school in function of the geography, but geographical disparities have become very severe. You live in one part, we know you are poor, we know to a large extent you are of a particular background and so on. And school mapping, as a result, in a number of countries has actually confirmed existing disparity. We can introduce busing, but that has its own challenges that we won't go into. And there are, I think, a number of aspects in the privatization package, though they are not intrinsically in there. There's a number of aspects which might be useful in order to reform public investment systems, without, of course, bringing all the ugly baggage along. The strengthening of the relationship between teachers and an immediate supervisor. But the relationship, which I agree has to be both one of support and supervision. That's important. You tend to have that more in private schools, unfortunately, than in public schools. There can be many caveats there, but still. The strength of the relationship between the school and its surrounding community, between the school and the parents. Again, we tend to have that maybe more in private schools than public schools. I'm certainly not people advocating privatization, but I would not like to have a model of public provision that does not allow for any reform, because the reform would be seen immediately as a step towards that ugly scenario of privatization.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me add a question from online viewers. One person is asking to say a bit more about the selection of the countries. This person was particularly wondering why there were none selected from Africa, but you could just repeat a bit more or extend what you were saying in the beginning. Thank you. Okay. We'll take 3 and then come back to 4. Answer.
Merci. Louis Saïda, je suis enseignant-chercheur. J'ai exercé pendant plusieurs années au Maroc et puis je suis enseignant en France. Je voudrais juste faire un petit commentaire comme introduction pour dire qu'il y a une tendance lourde qui se dessine de plus en plus. C'est le poids grandissant et important du secteur privé dans l'éducation et l'enseignement supérieur. Et que cela va produire ou produit de plus en plus de fractures sociales et des bombes à retardement. Alors, nous avons une reproduction sociale qui profite aux classes les mieux loties par les emplois et l'accès aux postes de responsabilité, alors que les classes pauvres et démunies sont de plus en plus exclues. Il y a une autre bombe à retardement, je ne sais pas si vous l'avez étudié dans votre livre, c'est l'endettement des étudiants et surtout américains pour poursuivre leurs études. Et on voit que de plus en plus, l'accès à des emplois bien rémunérés devient restreint, ce qui génère une situation catastrophique, explosive, matérialisée par l'incapacité des étudiants à rembourser, d'où une situation donc explosive de plus de 1000 milliards qui vont connaître le même sort que les subprimes. Alors d'où la question centrale qui doit être constamment posée. Quelle est la mission de l'école et quelles sont les valeurs que doit véhiculer un système éducatif? Est-ce que c'est la coopération, la solidarité, la justice sociale, l'équité, ou bien un système privé, privatisé, la rentabilité, la compétition, la concurrence, etc. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. We'll take one more and then turn back to the panel. There's a gentleman over here. And
Thank you. My name is Enrico Miotti. I'm from the Miotti Foundation in Milan. We take care of public education, particularly in the grades 1 to 8. I'm surprised that in all this discussion, we never came up with the issue of pedagogy, how we are teaching and what we are teaching. Just I was in London listening to Ken Robinson in January, and he said that we're going towards a narrowing of the subjects, a growing standardization, while society should go exactly to the opposite direction. And particularly, there's smaller space for art, for music, for things that connect people with their own self and with society. So I was wondering whether the researchers found this thing in a different way between public and private sector, and if you think that that's a big issue.
okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to give Frank the microphone to respond as he can.
Great, thank you. So on the question of the policy package, I think that, well, and this also addresses a bit of the country selection. You know, I find the Sweden-Finland comparison quite compelling, because I think they're probably more pretty much as culturally similar as you can get in different countries. And I think that they really did take a different approach. So that policy package actually shifted, and I would argue inverted, because I think Sweden's policy package was more sort of liberal, social democratic welfare state than Finland's was, and so they've swapped roles, and we see the results of that over time. So that I think is compelling, although your point is well taken about you know, there is a legitimate question of selecting on a dependent variable if you're using test scores as the only analysis in this study, which I'm not. I'm saying they're an indicator. I'm not saying that it's a causal study, but I am saying that it is an important policy question. And do I think that privatization or public investment entirely predicted the outcomes in these countries? No. but it is a very important part of the story from a policy lens. I think we need to attend to it. And I would say that if we think about different types of governments, it's interesting to me also that we have 2 Latin American dictatorships represented and 2 Scandinavian kind of, democratic models represented here. So there is a heterogeneity in the sort of type of government represented in this analysis, that and for the results to be so similar across the different governance is important. In terms of the geographic disparities, the social characteristics, I think that's a very legitimate question. There are many ways in which inequality is reproduced. The way I think about it in the United States, basically, if you're upper middle class, you have a $200,000 decision. Either you have $200,000 that's tacked on to your home price because you buy a house in a district that has a high quality public school and you defend that zip code to the death, or you pay $200,000 for a private school. And that's how the very wealthy and the wealthy in the United States reproduce their social inequality. That's just real. I mean, go house shopping somewhere in the US, you'll find out quickly. And then, in terms of the country selection, I think the African question in Asia, I think Africa is tricky. I don't know of a great public investment model in that context. I think it's a good question. I'd love to hear from the audience about that. Obviously, there are some countries that have adopted more or less of the privatization model. I think, and again, in Asia, I think India would be a great example of the sort of low-fee private schools involvement. Singapore would be another option for public investment, but those 2 countries are different in their GDP per capita, so you're a little bit out of, more in the apples to oranges comparison at that point. So the more thinking is going to be done on that. And on the situation of the student debt, I think that that's another way that access is being hampered. In Chile, one of the reforms in the privatization move by Pinochet was to start charging tuition for higher education. So depends on where the government, how much it's going to invest in the future of its citizens and its human capital. So obviously, the United States is making it more difficult through student debt, and other countries are as well, to achieve a potentially necessary degree for participation in the workforce. And then finally, on the pedagogy point, I think, well, I mean, I didn't explicitly say it, but I definitely indirectly pointed to it, because when I'm talking about test-based accountability, that is actually producing a situation of diluting the curriculum in favor of test preparation, specifically mathematics and reading. So, and it goes very deeply. I conducted student focus groups in certain schools in New Orleans where they have test prep classes as a content area. So you're not actually taking social studies, you're taking test prep. And they have just, online, they have students go to a school, but they basically all day they're online doing problems that replicate the test. So it's almost, you could call it a test prep school. And that's just to get your degree. And the learning outcomes, as we've shown, were very problematic across New Orleans, and in these schools in particular. So I think it's a huge issue that we're letting go of the arts and the humanities. Recess is gone, so you actually don't move your physical body, which is problematic because we're actually humans. And it needs to be said, sadly. And then I would argue that one thing we didn't touch about is our environment. We have a huge problem coming down the road, or already here, and we need to significantly extend our education systems to deal with the plurality of challenges that we're going to face in the next 50 years, and diluting it down is not the answer. So I do want to make one final point, which is, and that was getting back to this, the issue of whether governments provide education well. And what I would say is that in many cases they do not, and it is very, very inequitable across a lot of the decisions that we've just talked about. But I think the book argues that, so that's the bad part, right? And so the ugly part for me is increasing stratification by taking a model that is privatized to a variety of actors, and that actually increases inequity. And so the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good would be to have a high functioning, high quality public investment model that addresses equity as a cornerstone of its model. So it's not about returning or fomenting public systems or governments that don't adequately provide education. Those need to actually change too. How, that should be the conversation we're having, instead of what Martin Carnoy called using the distraction of neoliberalism to take us away from the very hard work of actually doing high quality education.
Thank you. Manos,
there's a couple of points, because of course the attention is on the book and the content, but I thought that was a very interesting point about pedagogy and the fact that, you know, if I remember well, Ken Robinson actually doesn't complain about the private schools, complains about the public schools and the industrialized model. Because to some extent, of course, there are private schools that really drive this standardization, attendance, focus on the prep tests and etc. But there are also the alternative private schools that everybody hopes will provide the innovation that any national education system needs. So I think that the question is, how can we prevent our public education systems again from, and is there an alternative model for them to imbue all these other values and value systems that we need, especially with the challenges that face us today. But you know, in reality, there's more variety within the private sector from that point of view than with the public sector, and it's this issue of, again, decentralization versus centralization. If you have a centralized system, you control everybody, and everybody has to fit particular approaches. So there's a big challenge there. Our colleague from Morocco, I was surprised that you mentioned the student debt of people in America, but I think Morocco is one of those countries that actually do suffer now from an increasing phase of privatization. It's a case of social fractures, as you said. It starts at home, and I think another good example of a country that, in theory, is a public investment case, but actually is not, and is turning upside down, is Argentina. Increased the incredible amount of fragmentation and stratification of schools, even though in theory the system there, until the current government, has been a public investment type of model. As we're speaking, I remembered my supervisor. I think the most famous study of comparative study of this kind was done in the 80s. Compared Kenya and Tanzania. John Knight. I don't know if you know. Yeah. And that was a very interesting comparison, which to some extent would be interesting to revisit. It was comparing two different approaches to expanding an education system. And at the time, if I remember well, it was actually saying that the Kenyan system, which was more open, did not, let's say, cut access to secondary education, did not control it so tightly, which was the case of Tanzania. The Kenyan approach was much more open, invited communities to participate, and expanded the system, and that was actually much more, had more positive repercussions overall across the board. But let's not forget that Tanzania, within East Africa, has had relatively good learning outcomes, so that could be a potentially interesting comparison if you wanted to.
But you'd have to choose certain historic periods, because under Nyerere he kept it relatively selective, to change the ethos of those getting education as having a responsibility to all society, and then but over time it's expanded, and there's certainly plenty of private schools in Tanzania today. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to open it up. I do want to be sure we tap some of the questions that we've been receiving online. So one listener, viewer, has asked if you could say a bit more about how you think the state, U.S., is retreating from its responsibilities. There are a couple of questions that kind of overlap. There was one about mixed models, and it may have been you've been talking a lot about in any one context, there have been shifts over time, and different models are in fact mixed models. The cases that you have are some of them are quite mixed. So, and then we've got what are the lessons for low and middle income countries, keeping in mind context, politics, and government structures. This comes from a colleague in Oxford Policy Management. So let's open the floor. So that's one question for you. Okay, we've got this gentleman here, Uke, and then please.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for your presentation and also the discussion by Manos. I'm Hugues from IIEP. I have a question which deals probably less with policy than with politics, because your books does not only lead to policy recommendations, but also is in a way very political, which actually I appreciate a lot. And in probably two ways. The first, because you embrace a large political and historical context. So you deal with real politics and you use real words like neoliberal, social democrats, all of these things. The second thing is also because at the end, it's a very scientific approach, but one can also consider that it's a little bit politically biased, because in a way, the approach that leads to better learning outcomes could be considered more on a certain side of the political, range than on the other side. And if I ask the question, it's because in our institutions and the institutions we work with, or in the kind of findings of research that we mostly use, it's much less political. It would be much more, either in economic literature or in the grade literature that our institution produce. It would be more kind of neutral, more technical in a way to kind of bring the different findings and prepare or opt for different policy recommendations. So my question here is, how do you think this way to be very political and relevantly political has an impact on the way your book has been received and perceived by different audiences, and especially audiences where you kind of bring these policy recommendations at the table and bring it in a way that is also based on the scientific approach. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a link in the back. I'm gonna make Camilla do a lot of walking. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming.
No.
And please remember to introduce yourself.
Hi. Okay.
Okay.
I'm Pablo Liudinsky. I am doing a master thesis on regulation of private education in Kenya and Uganda. So my question was, if regulation, because you mentioned the difference between deregulation and re-regulation, which I thought was a very interesting point. And how could a better regulation, perhaps, because the proponents of private education defend that they bring new things to the table and they're more efficient, and different conclusions that they draw. So how could a better regulation perhaps drive these results that the proponents may have to actually have in the US? Or of course the situation would be maybe a little different for countries that have a weaker capacity of government control and so on, but what about the countries that do have?
Okay, there's one on the side, and we've got Jordan and another. There you are. Yes. Okay. I think we may do a third round if you don't mind.
Hi. My name is Barbara, and I am originally from Chile, so I'm very interested in this book. And I am from UNC Chapel Hill as well, doing international education policy. So I wanted to know a little bit more about the effect, if any, of the political transition in Chile on the pyramid of key elements you explained in the beginning on policy drivers, economic rationales, and education mechanisms. Because, of course, as you presented, during the dictatorship, there was a forced privatization of the public education sector. But then, after the transition to democracy, this privatization continued, and there were some measures to address the setbacks provoked by this reform. So I'm interested in knowing, how do you account for the political factor? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll wait, and Jordan, you're first, and then we'll come back to the colleague over here. Go ahead, Frank.
Great, thanks everyone for the rich questions. So on the U.S. Retreating from responsibilities, I think that's you could say retreating, or you could say has never really provided. The U.S. has a long history of segregation, and that's been a back and forth, which kind of gets to the mixed model question. But the basic thing is that schools were explicitly segregated, and then what I explained before about housing is more of an implicit model of segregation. That's a way to, you had the phenomenon called white flight, where after desegregation, in general, white Americans moved to the suburbs and created their own school districts. I live in a city called Oakland in California. The city has literally a protectorate inside of it called Piedmont, which is its own sort of very high socioeconomic status group of people that form their own Vatican within the walls of Oakland, and it's incredibly segregated to the point where they have their own social services. So that's just one prime example of how the different ways in which segregation can be replicated. So how do you address that? You have to have a multi-scalar, multi-dimensional, multi-sector equity conversation, of which education is one part. And so I think there is a role for government to actually play in addressing that. And interestingly, in California, just in the last 2 years, we have instituted a progressive redistribution of taxation system where all of the money for taxation, instead of being pooled within the district, is pooled at the state level and then dispersed to districts, while taking into account language minority students, students with special needs, and other factors. So the demographics and the marginalized students are actually being taken into account in terms of the money it will take to provide for the education. So that's underway. That's an extremely political decision, which gets me to this. Well, actually, I want to take first the mixed model. So that actually is a great example of a mixed model of how these situations shift. So I think the power of the mixed model is within a given context. For instance, in Canada, or particular in California, which we haven't done that research because it's very recent, that gives you the capacity to even potentially do some more causal inference studies on those particular policy shifts. So what would you find with this break in policy or shift in policy and before and after, in addition to the comparison groups? The lessons for the low income and mix, I think this gets a little bit to the political question, because I would say the lessons are there are in every education system inflection points where you have options and politicians take decisions, and there is a lot of pressure. And one of the things that honestly we don't discuss in this book is the whole international realm of influence that's going on, both from the private sector and within institutions like UNESCO, the World Bank, IMF, the International Finance Corporation. All of these organizations are all having involved as stakeholders in the conversation, and they all have interests. So I think the lessons are you want to be very careful about the decisions you make, and you know, pay attention to the actual research and outcomes from these studies, which gets to the question about the political nature of the book. You know, I think it is political, and I do think it's important to name the terms that we're talking about. Like, neoliberalism is an actual phenomenon, if we don't even say it very much. But more importantly than that, it has impact. So what are the impacts? What are the findings? And the findings are important. And I also think that, you know, not everybody is interested in education for profit, but there are a few that have an interest in profit over education, and they have sometimes have a lot of money. So they are funding reports and studies and essentially public relations campaigns around what actually works when the evidence is on the ground that it's not working. And I think this book really tries to point out from an evidence base how these policies are impacting students, families, and systems over time. And it's compelling. I think the evidence we present is compelling that this is not has not been shown to be a productive line of organizing your system over decades. And so on the deregulation, re-regulation point, I think, you know, when we sort of what I meant by that was that the you know, when you regulate, you know, you're always making regulations, and even if the rule is there are no rules, that's still a rule. So, you know, that the government has an important role to play in defining the terms of engagement with anyone, the public or the private sector. So, and that is part of the question that we're asking. Obviously, countries have many private schools and models in place. So how do we determine, and this is a lot of work I think that UNESCO does well, that Manos referenced, was how do we determine what is actually helping with the equity question of education with the SDG 4 and which aren't, and how do you start orienting your systems towards those models? And then in Chile, I would say after the reform, that's very new, so we didn't really get that much into it in the chapter, but you know, I would say that the shift is really it's sort of a hybrid model right now, and I mean, because you did not move away from a voucher system, so the fundamental mechanism is still in place, and there is a restriction on the market. So there is an abolishment of school fees. There's, you know, and school selection, and by that I mean the co-pays. So, you know, but abolishing co-pays, so Sweden actually didn't have co-pays, it's legal. No, actually, no, abolishing profit. So Sweden you're not allowed to make profit in Sweden, but that has ancillary problems to it as well, as we discussed in the Swedish chapter. So it is a question of whether and how much opening this sort of involvement with the private sector writ large will go down a road on the more full-scale adoption of this, and there are many pressures for that happening. So I think the real job of governments is to attend to the needs of their citizens, all of their citizens, and make sure that the roads that they're going on are in the direction of equity and not other directions.
Thank you. Manos, thank you.
Just a couple of points to my colleagues, I guess, Oxford, or former colleagues.
Yes.
What are the
OPM.
What are the lessons? I think the lesson is governments have to be vigilant, and they should not be taking any advice that comes really these days. I think there are a lot of problems. Let's not forget, it's not a homegrown solution. Like what is happening in Liberia is not something that came out of the country. It was like presented as a solution. I think that's really very slippery slope. And I think one also has to be careful how we will interpret the evidence that will come when we evaluate the results. I mean, it will be because as maybe some of you know, there is a study happening at the moment which will show whether the new model is working. But it's in a laboratory environment with so many different conditions controllable that actually cannot then go ahead and generalize on the basis of the 2% of schools what will happen to the rest of the 98% of schools. So it is important to be vigilant, but I think it's also important for governments to be responsible, more responsible than they have been. We talk about regulations, but actually all the regulations that governments, and I'm familiar with some parts of Africa where the governments have, of course, some rules in place for how to regulate private schools, but the rules are just really ridiculous. I mean, you would not believe that such rules could possibly exist, and they're just there for corruption. They're just there to impose such terms on private schools that, and I'm talking about, let's say, a few years ago at least, or homegrown private schools rather than the chains that are now appearing. They're out there to get schools and make sure that they take a bribe to the inspector who will come and give the permission to operate. So responsibility is also therefore called upon on the side of the government. Just the regulation by itself is not a cure. We know that the problems, the capacity problems that exist in making these public functions work properly.
Okay. Thank you very much. So microphone to Jordan, please. You have it? Thanks. Hold on, it's gone off again.
I have a question in relation to equity and regulation, but perhaps it's been answered. So maybe I'll make a comment in relation to that. I think the example you gave, Frank, of California's attempts to address the question with regard to, residential taxes and redistribution there. It's been tried before in California, virtually 13, 14 years ago. But if you look at those high income districts, they then created foundations to reinvest more money, which again, created greater inequity. So I'm not sure regulation always works. And I think the point you made, Manos, about looking at vigilance in the system is extremely important. But I want to come back, perhaps the question here is a larger question, because some of the attempts, if you look at the vouchers and the kind of buy-in from poor African-American communities, they saw this as a means for addressing their inequitable position. And sometimes that argument has been used in other contexts for privatization because it's to create a better offer for excluded communities. Is that possible from the experience you've had? And I think some of the attempts at creating that have created pointing to thinking about South Africa and the creation of a quasi-private system within the public system.
Meaning Model C.
Which is, or even now with the eradication of Model Cs, you have a de facto Model C system continuing through decentralization. So I think this issue of decentralization, equity, and regulation are totally interconnected.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a colleague gentleman here. No, you're done. Okay. Right. Let me add a question. Camilla, some here. Let me share a question from an online viewer. Did the study make an analysis of the impact on college students of the different policy choices, the drivers, and particularly the kind of debt that students left school with? And can you comment on that? Yes, please.
I'm Adamson. I was and I was my question is, like, it says that accountability mechanism, like through risk-based accountability to teachers, that not actually give a better result. But my question is, is the result of the poor governance, like the education governance, so isn't the private education model like an alternative solution to the people? Do not trust the private public education because of like illegal private tuition and other like corruption. So they would trust the private education. And the other thing is, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, we are generalizing that private education embedded in all countries. The examples of 3 or 4, but in some countries, the private education or education governance reform is happening like until like Plus 2 degrees. So it is too early to assess the impact of this system. Can't we just assess like how much time did it take for public education in the country to ensure equity and others like better results?
Okay, interesting set of questions. We'll come back to the panel and then we have a final round. Okay.
Okay, so interesting to think about the question of vigilance in the system, because actually that's built into the state law. So in addition to the local control funding formula, which is quite hilariously named since they're actually doing state control funding, but they have the local control accountability plan, which specifically mandates community engagement so that the community would be involved in knowing how their funding is working and how they can have reciprocal accountability with their policymakers. Of course, who does this? Who does this community engagement? Who are the people that actually get out there and see what's happening in the classrooms and bring it to the community and have community input? And the answer is really not very many people, and it's not really well known how it happens if it is happening. So it's a huge issue actually, and I think it's a problem, and it's something we're actually trying to do research on at my institution, because there's basically, well, in the United States we have a dearth of evidence-based policies, so we're trying to figure out how there can be more evidence brought to bear on that situation, and that kind of points to the third question. So I understand that maybe there's a solution could be private education, and there might not have been enough time, but I think that a generation in these countries is enough time. We have compelling evidence over time, and I think that instead of offering up more childhoods to a model that we don't see is working, when we have opportunities to invest in models that are working, I think it would be a mistake. And then getting back to the college students, we did not look very much at tertiary education in this particular book. The book was written actually as a trade book, not an academic book, because we think that, and that in itself is a huge decision. A trade book, so is a book written for a popular audience. So we didn't want to make a case study with indecipherable statistical terms, except to a subset of a subset of a subset of people. We wanted to actually talk about the arguments that were in play, which is why in the triangles we try to distill the main arguments that are happening in the debates, which can then of course come across as black and white. We don't want to do that. We don't want to. And actually the book opens with these countries on a spectrum, so we do talk about that on a spectrum. But I think there is compelling evidence that some solutions have worked better than others at this point.
You okay? All right, Greta Sophie, you had a question? There's right here, the second row here. Thank you. Okay, you're coming back. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Greta Sophie Bratteli. I'm working in the Norwegian delegation to UNESCO. I have a question regarding the distribution of money, the amount of money spent from governments. You put forward several economic arguments which are used, but I can't. Did you also investigate the distribution of money? I mean, the amount of money. Has there been any change when there was a shift in policy in these countries where you have been conducting the study? Or have you been able to see any linkage between an eventual shift in the amount of distribution, allocation of money, and the impact of on the society as such, and of which criteria eventually?
Okay. Thank you. And the gentleman at which.
So my name is Tomas Pereira. I'm a research fellow in Morocco studying graduate unemployment. And I'm also an indebted graduate student from the site, so that kind of goes with the conversation. My question is, so we've talked about public and private. We've talked about the role of education. I'd like to kind of go back towards that specific question of the role of early childhood education, the role of primary education, the role of secondary education, the role of tertiary, because to me they're very distinct. We live in a world now where there's huge transitions in terms of labor market outcomes, and labor market is shifting their feet. And so what is kind of the role that you see in terms of private-public partnerships in tertiary education? I know you didn't really talk about that in your book, but what role do you see in public-private partnerships to reallocate budget towards more, to have kind of a both, to join both pieces of the puzzle and bring kind of a private, efficient service delivery, regulated perhaps, or re-regulated, however you call it, in the tertiary system, and then reallocate the funds towards early childhood, primary, in or government-controlled setting.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, we'll turn it back to the panel.
Thank you. So on the policy shifts, we did see both original inequities in distribution and then shifts towards inequities in distribution. I think specifically in the Swedish model, we saw inequities distributed in the allocations. I think that after this model was implemented, so fairly recently, the distribution between students on a per capita basis was between $8,000 and $14,000 a year, which is a huge difference when you look at just percentage-wise that difference. So instead of and by the way, that directionality of that was inequitable. So you have your higher performers or your higher socioeconomic status students, they're the ones getting the greater sums of money, right? So on the equity spectrum, where there's equality and then equity where you're addressing the needs of the marginalized students, and inequity, this is on the inequity spectrum. And I would say the same was held in the Chile model, and it's certainly in the United States. The resources have been phenomenally inequitably distributed. The labor market analysis I did in New York and California showed that if you are a teacher in the Long Island system, you are automatically making more than a New York City teacher, automatically. And then if you are in a school that is in a lower poor neighborhood versus a wealthier neighborhood, I think 11 miles away, there's a $30,000 difference in your salary. So you're talking about, and then what that means is the types of teachers you aggregate, and we control for teacher experience in this. So we're actually controlling. It's not just like, oh, they have all the, more experienced teachers, you have to pay more. When you even control for that, you're still finding this massive difference in salary. So, and the same for California in the Bay Area labor market, the differentials are tens of thousands of dollars, which have huge equity ramifications for who gets what experience at the classroom level. In terms of public-private partnerships in the tertiary education, again, we didn't really talk about that. I think that's the tertiary versus public primary education or primary secondary education. That debate's been raging for, 40, 50 years. I mean, for the World Bank publishing, this focus on tertiary education as a driver of the social good, and then, decades ago. So I think that's a debate, and I would say, but I think from an equity perspective at a national level, if you don't have a functional public primary and secondary system, you need to provide that, because there's just a basic level for participating in the labor market, as you talked about. How do you redistribute across that? I mean, I think that would, for me, that's the primary focus of an education system, to have that that baseline level, and it's a huge question is whether that baseline level now includes tertiary, because that is also a place where market differentiation happens in a huge way. In the United States, the difference between a college graduate and a high school graduate in income is a massive difference. So you could argue that that would include basic education, would include tertiary education, and then but it gets tricky because then you go into graduate education because some fundamentally unequal systems constantly seek advantage. So how can the government at least try to mitigate that either through regulation or implementation issues or implementation strategies to at least move towards delivering on the equity promise of SDG 4?
That's good. Thanks for the question on the different levels. I mean, we don't necessarily have to answer it in economic terms, even if I'm an economist. We know about the right to education. The right to education said provide elementary education. At the time, and of course progressively, according to the capacity of the country, provided to the higher levels. Now, I would rush to say that unless you're Norway, and you sit on a lot of gas, and your tertiary education is not only free, but also provides massive subsidies to students to cover their living costs, then probably you should not expect to be able to provide free tertiary education because it will be inequitable. I mentioned earlier, it costs a lot, and therefore you have to take some decisions. But there was no discussion at the time of the declaration about pre-primary education. It didn't quite feature in people's minds, and it is an issue worth revisiting and asking, actually, is that the one? Now, let's not forget, about half, I mean, depends how, 2 out of 3 children currently attend at least 1 year of pre-primary education the year before they go to primary. If you take the entire age group, this percentage falls. But within that, you have massive differences between countries. Now, the question is, how do you actually ensure universal coverage, assuming a society believes in it, right? Because there are still societies that have not quite jumped on the idea of pre-primary education for all. But if we take the argument that it is extremely important, if done properly, and we need to invest in it, then of course the issue arises, how do you finance, and whether you need to shift, and whether actually does make sense. But we should be very careful because many of these systems will start from zero. Shifting resources to bring in the first generation of children who will go through pre-primary education will be the urban children that already are much better placed to benefit from the education. So we have to be careful exactly how we plan our intervention, what groups we target, so that this is a transfer of funds that actually does benefit the poorest. So it's not as straightforward to say shift from one to the other. It depends who is going to benefit.
Okay. Back to you, Frank.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one more point on the early childhood. I mean, I think the research shows that some of the achievement gap, if not the majority of it, is already accrued by the age the child enters pre-primary or primary school. So that is a huge issue about how, if you're going to address the issues of socioeconomic inequality, you're going to have to start doing it at an earlier age. So there is an imperative for the government to do that. And then I want to actually reflect back on the question about privatization in general, and this 41% of private funding of early childhood education. I think that there's I was just actually in Kenya, and the whole discussion was, I was trying to find an actual fully public school, right? Because everywhere I looked, there were school fees and people were paying this, that, and the other. And so the point I want to end on is that there is a heterogeneity of private roles in education, and that is real. And the question before us is how much should that be allowed, if at all? And I think that right now I don't think we're at an at all place, but I think we do need to use this analysis and other analyses to foreground the public role in public education instead of trying to outsource it wholesale to the private enterprise.
Thank you. When we started today's event, I highlighted that this is the fourth in a series of strategic seminars, strategic debates at IIEP since January, focused on equity dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. So I think that today's discussion has really highlighted a number of issues from we've had both from the floor and from the panel, comments on a wide constellation of policy choices. There's it's a complex world, education policy, and this issue on public versus private, public investment versus privatization. I hope that all of us are coming away with a more nuanced understanding of all the different dimensions to it. It's a complex issue. I think it's been important, the research that Frank and his colleagues have done, to pay attention to the learning outcomes as one starting point for looking at, well, what difference does it make over time? But also to take heart that as we have all, you're sitting in a UNESCO institute. UNESCO, one of UNESCO's core values is on the right to education, and that the primary responsibility rests with governments to provide education. And if they can't provide, then they can work with other providers, but the primary responsibility rests with the government. And I think we've seen through the presentations a lot of different ways that this gets done or not done, where government's responsibility is delivered or not delivered. And I thank the panelists for their comments today. This is supposed to be a universal agenda, and so although 4 of your country cases are in the Northern Hemisphere, this is still an issue that all countries in the world should be trying to pay attention to. Inclusive education. I thank the colleague for bringing in the pedagogical piece, because that's also huge equity dimensions involved in who's really, for whom is the teaching being done? Is it attentive to the different needs in the classroom? So a very rich presentation. I'd like to just let you know that the slides and the videos are online. They're uploaded on IIEP's the website or and then we'll on our YouTube channel we will have the whole live stream that was recorded thing. We will be taking a summer break. There's no seminar in August, but we'll be back with the rentrée, and we thank you very much for your participation, and we do hope that you will come again and participate in IIEP's strategic debates. Thank you again to Frank and to Manos, and thank you for lots of participations, most appreciated. You are being rewarded now with a cocktail up on rez-de-chaussée, the ground floor. Please join us for some refreshment and have an opportunity to talk among yourselves as well as with our speaker and our discussant. Thank you very much.